Hello, I'm Dr. Eleanor Yanega, and welcome to Gone Medieval from History Hit, the podcast that delves into the greatest millennium in human history. We uncover the greatest mysteries, the gobsmacking details, and the latest groundbreaking research from the Vikings to the Normans, from kings to popes, to the Crusades. We delve into the rebellions, plots, and murders that tell us who we really were. And how we got here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
We are so excited to have you on because this is one of those fan favorite sort of conversations. We're going to talk about the man, the legend, Owain Glyndwr. And I think we have to start off by acknowledging that his life and his rebellion are legendary at this point, which is why so many people want to talk about him. But it's sometimes difficult to scrape beneath those legends and the mythologies in order to get at the man himself. So can you paint us a bit of a picture about who he was before the uprising began and the sort of political, I guess, situation that shaped his early life?
Okay, wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, that's all. Just do that.
Yeah, fantastic. And you're absolutely right. I mean, he's become a myth. He's become a legend. I suppose we can talk about that later if you want as well, because it's so fantastic and such a big contribution of who he is this mythology that's developed around him. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's really interesting context where we find Owain Glyndwr, so being raised in the 14th century in Wales. So 14th century Wales, in a sense, is a very interesting period. It's a period where Wales is really changing. So 100 years before the Glyndwr Rebellion, Wales had been conquered by Edward I. And obviously that was then a dramatic change for people in Wales, certainly being ruled by a King of England. So that is a dramatic change, change in law for many people, change as well in how the status of people. You had a different legal status often if you were Welsh rather than English. So a lot of changes going on. And of course, on top of that, what else is going on in the 14th century?
Just a few things.
Other things, so Black Death and everything else going on as well. And so I was in that context where, the Welsh have been conquered. They've sort of, they feel that conquest a bit. And then, of course, everything else goes wrong. Black Death comes, periods of famine and so on. And I suppose people in Wales look back and think, well, this didn't happen before we were conquered. And so, it really is a complicated, but also a very turbulent time, a time that's ripe for rebellion.
So this has got to have knock-on effects for someone as a person as well. You don't come through the 14th century without being a little bruised, I guess, being a little bit, let alone when you are also dealing with what a new occupation looks like, with dealing with new rulers, new sets of legal codes, all of these things. So do you think that this is something that has knock-on effects for how Owain himself encounters the world?
Yeah, probably. I mean, he was born, in the 1350s, so, things
right
are
in it.
Down. Yeah, exactly. And I suppose, he was young. He would have been a young child when the plague came back with the children's plague and things like that. So children particularly vulnerable at that point. But I suppose he lived in a time where things had settled down a little bit since the conquest. So people had started to get used to it. But it's quite interesting that he's from families, the descendants of the rulers pre-conquest. So his family, you can think of what sort of stories would they be telling one another, how that might impact their identity as a family. His father was from the royal dynasty of Powys in Mid Wales, his mother from the royal dynasty of Deheubarth in the south. So he's been brought up in this context where this family knows that they used to have higher status. They're still obviously much better off than most people around them. And yet, there must be this feeling of frustration, growing up, and, of world turning upside down with, the Black Death and everything else. And I suppose, in that context, if you're trying to find your way in the world, we know that Owain Glyndwr was a soldier. He fought in the English army against the Scots and against the French. He probably didn't mention that when he later allied with them. But he had, so that was one way you could sort of succeed and do well in this new context, in Wales. So he did that, but, he might still be frustrated that that didn't lead him anywhere really. It didn't allow him to probably have the status that he felt he deserved.
I think that's a really interesting point because we have a tendency, especially as a result of what he ends up doing with his life, to sort of imagine that people are diametrically opposed to their rulers or their conquerors. But especially if you're coming from the ruling class, a lot of the time it can be, yes, I don't like this demotion, but still there are ways to sort of make my way up in the world. And we see people change sides all the time. I'm thinking about like El Cid in Spain around the same time, who's just like, I don't know who's going to hire me. And when you say this, you see this with Glyndwr as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because many of the people, Glyndwr himself, obviously, but many of his followers were people who were pillars of the establishment before the rebellion. So they were families who, I suppose, it's a matter of working out, well, this is the situation. We're ruled over now by English kings and by these martial lords. So we have to make do with the situation. And what's the best way to succeed in this context? We find ourselves. So, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about the rebellion. I think certainly there was oppression of the Welsh people before rebellion, but I suppose some people were also successful. There were some opportunities for the few who could sort of find their way. And what's then interesting is that even those who had done, the best out of the situation, many of them still rebelled when the opportunity came. So I'm not quite sure what that tells us. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what it tells us is that, the Welsh spirit is indomitable.
Well, of course.
Obviously. Okay, so Glyndwr's got this long military career under the English. Like it's not insubstantial. Mm-hmm. But he comes back to Wales in around 1400. When he gets back, what's happening for him at home?
He lives quite a comfortable life, to be honest. He's got 2 very nice estates. He is an important patron of poets. poetry is massive in Wales in this period. So we have real wealth of poetry from Wales, and Glyndwr has the privilege of having probably one of the more famous and best Welsh poets of his day, coming to his court and praising him. And we've got a fantastic poem praising Glyndwr's home and saying, obviously it's the best house in the world. So we've got all this poetry as well. And he really is part of this Welsh culture. And part of this culture as well is prophecy. So, and this will play a part in his rebellion as well. But prophecy has become a really important part of Welsh culture. So suddenly after the conquest, where people are looking for someone to save them, a messianic figure, if you like. And this has become a stream through the poetry. And, obviously this might be having an impact on him as well. And so he's part of this culture which is sort of praises the past, praises the heroes of the past, but also hopes for a better future. And we know that Glyndwr probably paid more attention to these prophecies than most, because we know he had a personal prophet as well. So someone who was with him, interpreting events in the line of prophecy and so on. So, it's easy for us to think that that's strange, but at the time, prophecy was very, very important.
Look, I'll tell you what, I don't think it's strange now. If I became a billionaire, I'm getting myself a prophet immediately.
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
that's my
Money
prophet.
Well spent.
Yeah, that is such a wonderful thing. And it's so incredibly very late medieval as well. People are, I think, across Europe, you see people who are really interested in prophecy, who are really interested in interpretation of anything from what they see as the current political landscape or the Bible, or both things brought together. There is rather a lot of it about the shop. And I think that we have a tendency to think that that's sort of wild now, but in a lot of ways it's its own kind of religious strand. And I do think that we get rather a lot of it out of Wales, though, don't we, as well? Prophecies of Merlin, I'm thinking here, all of these things that have very specifically Welsh roots that go on to dominate in other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, so Owain's at home, his very nice home, that I think we can all agree that it's wonderful. And he's vibing. He's got his prophet. He's got his poets. But something happens in there, right? So there has to be at some point in time when Glyndwr wakes up and he says, you know what? It's time. Like, a prophecy isn't enough. I've got to do it myself. What is it, do you think, that makes this tip over into action from just vibing?
Yeah, okay. Well, there is a debate about that, as often there is, about important events. There is clearly was a time, 1399, 1400, in Welsh history and in English history, the same things are happening. And, who's King of England has an impact on Wales as well. So that's part of the context. So, 1399, of course, Richard II loses the crown to his cousin, becomes Henry IV. And, some people of Wales are loyal to Richard II. So not Glyndwr particularly, possibly, but others are. So it's a period of turmoil. Things are changing. And also what really goes on at that time is that Glyndwr himself clearly faces personal injustice. And there are various stories about what happened. He's got a dispute between him and his neighbour, Lord Grey, of Ruthin. And is it about land? Is it about the fact that Lord Grey had stopped the summons from going to war, from reaching Glyndwr, and Glyndwr, as a result, seemed to be as if he wasn't an obedient vassal anymore? So there are various stories, but something happened which secured sort of injustice for Glyndwr, and even though he tried to secure justice in the royal court, he wasn't given it. And in a sense, that was the trigger, probably, for him personally. But in a sense, he represented a lot of injustice that people across Wales were facing. So it's sort of one example of what many people were facing. And that was the trigger. Whether he was thinking of rebelling anyway is another question. But that certainly was the trigger. And so what happened is that 15 men got together in his home at Glyndwr. the house where he's named after. And they proclaimed him, Prince of Wales. You go right to the top. You don't say, oh, well, we're going to complain and see what happens. We've got to change the world. And that's what they try to do.
I love that. Swing for the fences, baby.
Yeah.
But you mentioned this, he's getting people from across Wales. And I think that is one of the things that's really quite interesting about him, because he really manages to unite varying Welsh factions. And there have been historical divisions ordinarily, no?
Oh, absolutely. So Wales traditionally is very, very divided. And I suppose is one of the things when I speak to first year students, is one of the first messages when they introduce into Welsh history in this period, what you need to understand is the Welsh are as often as not fighting one another, more than anyone else, to be honest. But yeah, absolutely. There are historical divisions, amongst the Welsh, I mentioned earlier, his father's from one royal dynasty, his mother was from another. Historically, his, one side of his family would have been fighting against the other, so the Wales is traditionally divided. Sometimes a ruler comes along. So in the past, there have been people like Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, King of Wales, and so on. They'd managed to unite the Welsh, and he managed for a while. And then after their death, Wales splits up again. So yeah, historically, the Welsh often fought against one another. I suppose one of the ironies of conquest, in a way, is that it got rid of all these royal dynasties. So in a sense, it made the Welsh more united. So it was easier to unite people in some ways after conquest than it was before. Not that I'm going to thank Edward I for that, of course.
No. But I don't think that any of us need to hand it to Edward I.
No.
That's absolutely fine. But it is amazing how outside forces can create cohesive units out of people who ordinarily would not get on, though. I mean, I suppose we see this across history. So, he's able to, I suppose, use his own person, which is uniting. I mean, and I find that really interesting as well, because that's what a good medieval marriage is supposed to do, right? Like a good, solid, noble marriage should be smoothing things over, creating alliances, brokering peace in some way. And so Glyndwr, I suppose, is literally the man that he is meant to be here.
Yeah. And I suppose if you're looking around Wales at the time and thinking, well, the previous Welsh princes have gone, who's left, who has the best claim, who has the most royal blood in him? And yeah, because of his parents' marriage, he is the man with the best claim to be Prince of Wales. So absolutely, that really helps him then to draw people together. And if you imagine in this context, within Wales, these families, they've got connections, they're trying to marry into other families of status across Wales. It means that there is a network running through Wales of these families of the same status as Glyndwr. And so through this network, it's easier for rebellion to flow. So, with him, when he proclaims himself Prince of Wales, are his brother, his son, his sort of brothers-in-law with him as well. At the same time, his cousins rebel on Anglesey, the other side of North Wales. And then, he's got these family links with the south as well. So these family networks really, people are loyal to their family members, and that really helps to fan the flames of rebellion, I feel like.
And one of the things that really manages to help him out too is, so here's a man who is very possessed of himself. The minute he's like, I am the Prince of Wales, he manages to sort of break containment almost immediately. He doesn't just keep this as a local Welsh affair. He immediately starts reaching out to other major personalities, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he clearly, early on, the rebellion lasted a few weeks initially. So it started on the 16th of September, 1400. And it lasts for a few weeks and then sort of disappears, and it looks as if it's over. But over the course of 1401, it sort of reignites. And yeah, during that year then, when he's starting again, that's when he clearly is already thinking about the international element. So we have letters, or accounts of letters he wrote to the King of Scotland, asking for support, to lords in Ireland to ask for support. And I suppose the context, I don't know if you wanted me to say something about the context, because that's quite useful to know here. So at this point, of course, Wales has been conquered by England. Ireland has been conquered, but England's grasp on Ireland is sort of weakening at this point. Scotland is independent, has its own king, and then England is at war with France. Do you know the 100 Years' War? So, so I can see your face lighting up there when I mentioned the 100 Years' War. And so because of that, of course, it's really interesting political dynamics across Europe. And Scotland are allies of France against England. And so Glyndwr is already thinking, early in the rebellion, how is this going to succeed now? How can I spread this rebellion? And one of the ways he sees clearly early on is by getting some help from Scotland, getting the Scots involved, trying to encourage rebellion in Ireland as well, trying to have, attacks on England in different directions. And if he's to succeed, he needs to get help from the outside as well. Because, let's face it, it is going to be a David and Goliath struggle to try for Glyndwr to try and beat Henry IV. So he needs all the help he can get.
Yeah, and I'm correct in thinking that he also goes to the King of France as well, right?
Yeah.
I find this so fantastic because it's pretty ballsy stuff, right?
Yeah.
I suppose there is, the sort of connection that has existed between Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. At the very least, we're like, all my homies hate England, et cetera, et cetera. But the French, that's an interesting angle to try to work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it might seem strange to us, but I suppose this was the natural thing for Glyndwr to do. But we're very ambitious, but, he was successful as well. So it wasn't the first time that a Welsh ruler had tried to ally with France against England. So it happened first time in the 12th century. So the 12th century, the most important Welsh ruler, Owain Glyndwr, he had an alliance with France against Henry II. Then it happened 13th century, Llywelyn the Great against King John, had an alliance with France. And even just 30 years before the rebellion, there was another Welshman who proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. He was also called Owain, confusingly. Owain Lawgoch, Owain of the Red Hand. And he was a captain of Welsh mercenaries in France. So he fought with the French against the English during the 100 Years' War. He was a great nephew of previous Welsh princes. So he was, had a good claim to call himself Prince of Wales and was given an army by France as well to sail to Wales to take control. The weather stopped them, unfortunately. and they had to turn back.
Oh, no.
And he was assassinated before he could try again. So, but in that case, France had already supported the Welsh against the English. So it made sense, Glyndwr then, to think, right, okay, France, obviously, as the other European superpower, that's where I should turn. They're already in war with England. Why not take advantage of that?
Yeah, I suppose it's also really politically savvy because by tapping into that, Glyndwr is also saying, I understand the history of Wales. I understand the history of old connections. I'm simply the new iteration of this old impulse.
Yeah, absolutely. And he even changed his coat of arms to be the same as the coat of arms of the previous claimant the French had helped. So again, very clever in doing that. And
you can see really what's in it for the French as well. Like, this is going to wind England up. Absolutely no end, so.
Yeah. And really, it worked for a while, at least, so he got French support. So they formed a treaty, sent ambassadors to the French court. They formed a treaty, to work together against Henry IV. And they even multiple times sent soldiers to support him. Especially in 1405, there was quite a large French army who landed in Pembrokeshire and then campaigned across the south of Wales with Glyndwr and probably getting as far as Worcester, actually. So actually invading England as well as part of that. So.
Get them. Okay, so I suppose here is a good time as any to talk about what happens in terms of, the main moves that Glyndwr puts out. So he's got backup from other countries. Everyone agrees that we should be taking the fight to the English in one way or another. How does it all kick off?
Yeah, so it begins, September 1400. He's proclaimed Prince of Wales, and then things, go quiet.
So, how do people respond to an actual native Welshman being crowned Prince of Wales? This has to be the sort of thing that people want to say something about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously they had native princes in the past, but the conquest had happened now. But what's interesting is we have a poem from the time of the rebellion, which basically answers your specific question there. So the poet Iolo Goch was an old man by the time the rebellion happened, but he represents his own view. Does he represent others? Then quite possibly. But he's got a poem, and this is how he begins, responding to this fact that there's now a native Welsh prince. He says, "Behold the world caused by English arrogance. Very often have I wished to have a lord from amongst us ourselves." And he's and now the time has arrived, So he's rejoicing in the fact that Glyndwr has now started his rebellion. What's interesting is how the rebellion reignites again, and it's what I consider the first April Fool's joke, because on the 1st of April 1401, Glyndwr's cousins capture the castle of Conwy, so one of Edward I's impressive castles. They capture the castle while the soldiers are in church, because it's Good Friday. So the soldiers are all being very devout. They're in church, and when they come home from church, they find that the Welsh have taken their castle. So, which is a fantastic trick to play, of course. And really, that reignites the rebellion, because it's such an embarrassment to the English crown. And people then across much of North and Mid Wales think, oh, there we go, we've started again. And off they go and reignite the rebellion. And it's from that point then that Glyndwr starts to fight open battles. They win battles. And then he starts to get in touch with, the Irish, the Scots, and the French as well. And just over time then, for a number of years, the rebellion grows and grows as he has momentum. So first of all in the north, then in Mid Wales, and then ultimately 1402, 1403, no part of Wales is free from the effect of the rebellion.
He also ends up reaching out to places that you wouldn't expect, though, right? Because he goes and gets a hold of some English people as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the tripartite indenture?
Oh, wow. Now, that is interesting. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and again, that's why it's so interesting thinking of what's going on in England at the time, because there's so much tension. Henry IV is king. And, again, showing how politically savvy Glyndwr is, that he's not just taking advantage of war between England and France, but of, political upheaval in England itself. So what he does, he allies with the Mortimer dynasty, so one of the most important dynasties in England. What he does is he captures a representative of that family, Edmund Mortimer, in battle, and manages to turn him. And so
sounds the dream, isn't it?
Yeah. And so you've got this family then, the Mortimers, who have actually, you could argue, a better claim to the English throne than Henry IV. They support him. And then you've got the Percys, the most, powerful family in the north of England. They're in-laws of the Mortimers. They're connected with them. And so ultimately they ally themselves with Glyndwr as well. So what he's doing is he's playing on these difficulties now that Richard II has lost the throne. Some supporters are people who look back at the Richard II's period, and he's taking advantage of that. And he's creating, what you would refer to, in the end, this agreement, the tripartite indenture, which, I suppose, if you're not familiar with this document, and particularly if you live in England, it's a very strange document to think about.
But I think that we have this tendency to look at history as though everything is always a done deal. You know, the way that things shook out is the way that things were always going to be. And what's great about things like the tripartite indenture is it shows us there were other opportunities available. There are other ways of thinking about things that people attempted. And I think that that's really fun because people have a tendency, I mean, even with the Wars of the Roses, which is crazy, you know, and there's so much that is up in the air to say, oh, this all makes sense. It was always going to shake out this way. And gosh, there are some sliding doors that I really wish had come true.
Well, absolutely. And if you sometimes show a map to people of what was agreed in the tripartite indenture and sort of, they find it difficult to grasp what they're seeing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are various, points in history where people obviously planned for something different. And it's, for us, looking back with hindsight, it looks a bit odd. But just to describe what you might see if you would look at a map of the tripartite indenture. So basically it's an agreement between Owain Glyndwr, the Mortimers and the Percys to divide England between them. So the Percys are going to have the north of England, the Mortimers are going to have the south, and Glyndwr isn't just going to be prince over Wales, but also the western part of England. So places like Cheshire, Herefordshire, Shropshire, and so on. So that's basically, if that would have come true, they wouldn't really be in England. Which is again,
what might have been.
But I suppose it just, again, as you saying, it's sort of the grand scale of the rebellion. It shows how, the impact might have been not just on Wales, but, on other parts of the British Isles and other parts of Europe as well.
Yeah, these are super ambitious plans. And Glyndwr also has this, he's really interested in the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. You know, he wants to establish universities. He wants there to be a parliament. He thinks that there needs to be reform in terms of how governance works in Wales. And these are kind of fairly radical ideas, but there are also things that certainly exist in different parts of Europe at the time. Where is he getting this from?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating because you're right. It's not that he's ahead of his time. He's ahead of his time, I suppose, in a Welsh context. He's the first to think about these things in a Welsh context, and particularly the universities, although they've been around for a while. But in many parts of Europe, they're new. I know sort of Prague, for example, to mention something you might be familiar with. Prague, it's only fairly recently that Prague has been established. So in the Holy Roman Empire, it's quite new, isn't it, to have universities? There weren't any in Scotland, even though they were a completely independent kingdom. So he's really thinking about what they need to do to develop a forward-thinking, a successful, a permanent principality. But the answer to your question is that he had very experienced people around him. I mean, he probably, was a visionary himself, I suppose, just to start the rebellion. But he had people around him who were clearly very intelligent, very experienced, who knew exactly what they were doing. And, certainly there were a lot of clerics around him who were, among the top rung really of experience. So, for example, he had bishops who supported him. So bishops who were in place before the rebellion, was one bishop, John Trevor, Bishop of St. Asaph. He was a lawyer. He'd graduated in law. He'd spent time in Rome working, as one of the main judges in the papal court. He then worked as a diplomat for English kings. The rebellion comes along, and after a while, he switches sides. And of course, all those connections and experience and diplomacy, that's there. One of my favourite characters, actually, if you have, sometimes you have this game where who from the past would you like to spend time with? And, and who I like to spend time with, like to ask questions of, is Gruffydd Young, who was Glyndwr's chancellor. And he probably is seen as one of the people really behind these ambitious ideas. And he's the one that, Glyndwr's plan was to have an Archbishop of St. David's, who wouldn't just rule over the church in Wales, but also, of course, Western England as well. Why stop at the border? And Gruffydd Young, the Chancellor, the diplomat as well, he was the nominee for this archbishopric. So he is he's a fascinating character. As it happens, I'm in the process of, not quite out yet, but in a few weeks' time, There's a book that I'm working on with an artist, Dan Llewellyn Hall, trying to draw attention to some of these people around Glyndwr. So we've got portraits, biographies and poetry about the variety of characters who were integral to the Glyndwr Rebellion. So it's great to mention some of these people now here today.
Oh, no, I think that's fantastic, because one of the things that really strikes one about Glyndwr is the fact that he's a team player. Like this isn't one of these autocratic, it's all about me sort of guys, which is easy to think about people who go around crowning themselves prince. And surely, the Middle Ages is awash with men of that description, but that isn't what's happening here at all. You have this really interesting court milieu that is working towards a really ambitious goal.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that he is the leader of the rebellion, he is clearly the one that's leading it, that's directing it, that people are following him, particularly. But you're absolutely right. He's a team player and he gets all these people involved. All these people are contributing in their own different ways. Across Wales, you have local leaders of rebellion, people who know their area, who command the loyalty of their population. In this, I'm in Aberystwyth, in this area was a man called Rhys Ddu. He'd been sheriff of Cardiganshire before the rebellion. One of the other sort of pillars of the establishment. Now the rebellion comes along, he switches straight away, and joins the rebellion. And then he leads the rebellion at the local level. And you're thinking, I think you mentioned Parliament earlier, and I think it's really important to think about how Glyndwr was a team player in that sense as well. So we know that he held 3 parliaments, at least. So he held his first parliament in Machynlleth in 1404, then in Harlech in 1405, and then a third parliament in 1406. And there he had representatives from all the different parts of Wales under his control, and they were there to discuss. He was consulting with people. They were discussing things like, foreign policy. What shall we do with this alliance with France? What shall we do if we're offered a treaty with England? And, if a truce is offered and things like that. So they really are discussing things. He's consulting. I suppose it is his decision in the end. But there is an element of, of consulting and, getting these people together. And so it's interesting to think about, these parliaments, which, 3 parliaments, which he held, and again shows him as, as far as it's possible to be a team player when you're a medieval ruler, that he is a team player.
Now, you've mentioned that there are these 3 parliaments that are held, and I think that's a really important point, because what it shows us is how long this rebellion is going on for. It's really easy to look at a rebellion as a sort of single action. Maybe it lasts about a month or so, say you're the Peasants' Rebellion, fan favorite rebellion, one of my favorite rebellions, these sorts of things, but they get put down pretty quickly. This is actually going on for quite some time, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I suppose you could debate when it finishes, really, because it goes on for so many years. I mean, I suppose it starts off, Glyndwr, the first few years, 1400, 1402, it's your the sort of rebellion you might expect, where they're hiding in the mountains and appearing, and then they're disappearing again. 1403 onwards to 1407, say, he is acting as prince in many ways. He's not in control of the whole of Wales, but he is in many ways acting as prince. And then after that, things gradually deteriorate. He basically, Wales is reconquered by the English crown over a series of years. And I suppose 1409, you could say, it looks as if it's over. So it takes 9 years for it really to look as if it's over, but it's still not over, because he's still in hiding, and he still has loyal followers, and they're still raiding into Shropshire, they're still raiding in different parts of Wales. And really, he's got ambassadors like Griffith Young I mentioned earlier. He's got ambassadors representing him in France, at least into 1417, trying to still get the French to support him again. And it's only 21 years after the beginning of the rebellion that his son accepts a pardon. So, I mean, that's the final act, I suppose, of the rebellion, where until that point, his son wasn't willing to give up. So it shows you, again, it's long lasting. And I think it's one of the things, we think of the rebellion, we know it failed. And therefore, we think, as you say, it's like one of the other rebellions that might have happened. But to think that it was successful for a while and that it lasted so long, I think is something that people might probably find surprising.
Yeah. And I think that when we look at output from the court and things that are happening at the time, that people really seem invested in this. They're like, oh, great, it's all happening. Like, so for example, when Glyndwr is Crown Prince of Wales, a lot of people record this. We've got stuff from poets and writers. Like, what do we see being created in terms of cultural output around this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in terms of poetry, we have a few poems from the period, but actually not that many. There might be multiple reasons for that. So in terms of that, then some poetry, but what we do have, I suppose, are the letters that Glyndwr sends out. These letters that contain his vision, that show his authority, and that show his voice as well. And there's a historian who refers to Glyndwr and his angry voice. and you get a sense of some of the letters about how angry he is about the situation that people in Wales find themselves in. And sort of, there's this anger that does come across. But I think the contribution, I mean, the legacy in that sense, or the cultural, the culture that comes out of this is his ideas. So the ideas that he produces, they have an influence that speak to people, centuries later, really. And I mean, there are various attached to these documents. Of course, you have seals and sort of his seal as a symbol of what he stands for as well. So I suppose those are the cultural legacy of the rebellion.
Okay. So from the other side, what are the English writing about this? I need to know what the haters are saying.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, there is a lot of animosity towards the rebellion in England. And of course, especially if you think of places on the border with Wales, they are actually being attacked. And I suppose one of the things that shows the strength of the rebellion as well is that, some communities in England actually pay Glyndwr because they say they pay him off. Protection money, if you like, saying, well, we'll pay you if you won't attack us. But certainly there's a lot of fear. And I suppose there is that feeling in England at the time that they have to face war on multiple fronts. They're not actively fighting against the French at this time, but they could be. Mm-hmm. There are rebellions in England against Henry IV's rule. The Scots, of course, are always invading. And now you've got the rebellion in Wales to contend with as well. So there is quite a lot of fear in Wales. There is even evidence of graffiti being written in churches and monasteries in England of people say, God, please save us from Glyndwr, So clearly there is this real sense of fear. There is also a sense, I suppose, of admiration, though, sometimes in some chronicles, because there's one example I can give you is of a man called Llywelyn ap Gruffydd Vychan from Carmarthenshire. And he was someone who actively sacrificed his life for the rebellion, So he led Henry IV on a wild goose chase, pretending that he was going to take him to Glyndwr. And after it became obvious that he wasn't going to take the king to Glyndwr after all, he turned to the story in an English chronicle goes, he turns to the executioner and offers his head. And says, well, I'm not going to betray my leader. And in those chronicles and so on, you sometimes get this sense of admiration for you. Well, we can learn from this, actually. And of course, there's also, as you can imagine, we've mentioned religion and prophecy already. Sometimes they do write about the Welsh Rebellion and say, well, is this a punishment? Is God, there's, so there are elements, like that. But I suppose Glyndwr really grasps the imagination of people in England at the time. And that's, partly led to, Shakespeare's depiction of him and so on. This idea that he's a wizard, that he controls the weather, that you think he's here and he disappears and he appears somewhere else instead, So you get this sense, especially if you're with an English army and you arrive in Wales and the weather turns and you can't go any further and you have to turn back because of the weather, is that Glyndwr? Can he control the weather? So there's a real mystique that grows around him, and it's present, or it begins at least in some of the accounts of him in England at the time.
So for you, as a historian who's doing work on this person who is literally portrayed as magical at some points in time, is it, do you find yourself being cast as kind of Captain Bringdown sometimes? You're having to go in and be like, that's just a guy, and try to sort of sift through all this myth.
I do. Anyway, there's so much that's interesting about it anyway. So, I'm not quite sure how many people actually believe that he's a wizard. I don't think I've sort of.
I'm choosing to.
Yeah, well, I suppose. I'm not quite sure how many people are actually disappointed by the fact that he's not a wizard. But but I suppose there's so much of interest concerning him anyway that definitely people are. I don't have to feel that I'm disappointing anyone, and I suppose the disappointment might be for some people if I tell them that he's not still alive somewhere.
Under a hill, surely.
Under a hill, yeah. Because, of course, there are also these legends, as you can imagine. He's like a King Arthur figure as well, in some sense. And there were all these legends and stories that, folklore growing up around him, which about, he's sleeping in a cave somewhere. And all you need to do is to find him and he'll come back at the right time.
I love how medieval people do that. Almost everyone has King Arthur, but the Czechs have Saint Wenceslaus, the Germans have Barbarossa, and it's like, and the Welsh have.
Okay, absolutely.
Come on.
But it's a long-lasting legend, though. It's not just a medieval legend. It's sort of, people for centuries. These have been recorded in later centuries. These stories about, he was at this cave, and then people, of course, having their own local connection to the Glyndwr rebellion, so various landmarks called after Glyndwr, showing the impression he'd left on the memory on the landscape, really. I mean, in the village I grew up in Llangernyw, in sort of the middle of North Wales, and there was a legend there that Glyndwr had hidden in the woods there, So you've got sort of, again, everywhere you go in Wales, they'd have their different stories about a landmark which was connected to Glyndwr, and so on. So he clearly had left a deep impression on people. So it's not surprising that people are still interested in him today.
Yeah, do you find it difficult kind of sorting through the folkloric ideas of Glyndwr? I guess you've got the cultural Glyndwr and you've got the historical Glyndwr in a way.
Yeah, and I suppose, in a sense, both represent him in different ways. And although, of course, in many of these myths, we might not go and say, actually, that's actually correct, and so on. They might not be factually correct, but they still represent what he's meant to people. And so they're still an important part of his story. And you can see the impact he had. There's a story about him, after the rebellion, getting up early, and walking across the hills, and he meets an abbot, and he tells the abbot, abbot, you've got up early, this morning. And the abbot tells, no, you've got up early, but by centuries, and that's sort of, and this sense that he was a man before his time, so all these myths. So I think there are so many documents from the period, that it is, it's possible. I mean, how well do we know people from the period is another question, but you can certainly get a gist of what he did, what were many of his qualities, and so on. So you can differentiate the myth from the time. I mean, his letters, as I mentioned before, were very, very important in trying to understand him. But I suppose as historians, we need to be careful that we don't just dismiss all the myths about him as well, because certainly for people in later centuries, that's as much part of his story as what he actually did. And certainly he's had such an impression and a legacy after that his legacy is important to consider and has an impact as well.
I think that's a really important point, because I think we have a tendency now to look at myths, or even use the word myth to sort of mean falsehood or fabrication. But really what myths are is explanatory stories. They're stories that help us to understand how particular cultures are dealing with something. And so it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not these stories are true with a capital T. What matters is that people are telling them and what that says about the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And in a way, Glyndwr then has been reimagined for different people at different times as well. So you can imagine your 19th century when people are starting to campaign for universities in Wales, for a Welsh parliament and so on. Then he becomes that figure, that visionary figure who developed these ideas initially. So, and then you can imagine now with, for example, campaigns for Welsh independence, then obviously he's a figure that people can latch onto then, for campaigning for independence, as well. So, people in different periods pick on what they find interesting, what speaks to them. And so different parts of rebellion and of him as a character, become important at different points in history.
Can you talk a little bit about what he means for Welsh people now? I mean, he's certainly one of those names that comes up over and over again when you are talking about the history of Wales. And you can see why anyone in the 19th century would want this. In the 19th century, everyone is so incredibly busy creating the national myth again,
yes, exactly,
for why they are a country, why they are a place. And you'll see this all across, Europe, whether it's for German unification or, arguments for nations seceding from varying empires. Mm-hmm. So I can understand why Welsh people are doing it then, obviously. But that doesn't mean that people aren't still doing it now, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting, so before I answer that question, what's interesting is in terms of the 19th century as well, you mentioned in other places they use these heroes as a way of justifying themselves being an independent nation. I suppose in Wales in the 19th century, it's not really about being an independent nation, but about showing about developing Welsh culture, but as part of a British UK context as well. So it's sort of quite a different connotation in Wales. But I suppose if you go through Wales today, you will pass many Glyndwr flags. So you can see the people still take hold of him today. So you'll see the red and yellow flags across Wales. And so, yeah, he does mean he's another representative of Welsh identity, of Welsh sense of nationhood, absolutely. And I suppose people feel that he's an important part of history, whether they know much about his history or not. I mean, what he represents is more famous than what he actually did, I suppose. And, now that, certainly he is being taken hold of now in terms of political campaigning. So, as I mentioned, campaigning for Welsh independence, for example, he is a figure. He's not, actually that campaign mostly thinks about the future rather than the past. But when he does think about the past, it does mention him in that context. So he does have an underlying sort of subconscious, I suppose, general place in the way the Welsh people see their identity. And it is then sometimes brought to the fore when it comes to various campaigns.
I could talk to you about this all day, but unfortunately for everyone, my face hurts from smiling now. So I'm going to have to let you go. But Owain, this has been an unmitigated delight. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to Dr. Owain Emlyn once again, and to you for listening to Gone Medieval from History Hit. Remember, you can enjoy unlimited access to award-winning original TV documentaries, including Professor Michael Livingstone's amazing new series on medieval rebels, as well as ad-free podcasts by signing up at historyhit.com/subscription. You can follow Gone Medieval on Spotify, where you can leave us comments and suggestions, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell all your friends and family that you've gone medieval. Until next time.